All right, let's do this. I'm just going to jump right into the results. So if you haven't seen the original video with the blind test, go watch that first. All good? Okay, here is where the cuts were. Now, before I get into any analysis, I do want to cop to two mistakes that I made. The first is that a couple of pops managed to creep into the recording, and I didn't notice them before publishing. The most prominent being at around 242 in the original video, and that faked out a lot of people into thinking that there was a cut there. There actually was a cut a little bit later, but it was clear that people were cluing into the pop thinking it was an edit. The second is that while the tone you hear in the last two sections of the track is the one I originally dialed in, the first section had a lower drive setting. Once I had the tone in a mix, I felt like it wasn't right for the first section, and I also wanted to see if I could keep the match going at different drive settings on the amp. However, that means there's a change going from the first section into the second section, and that's exactly the kind of thing that pricks up people's ears in a comparison and fooled a bunch of people into thinking that was a cut point. I totally wasn't thinking about this when I did it, and I should have known it would fake people out, which was not my intention. So I apologize. Both of those things were my bad and detracted from the experiment. That said, I don't think those mistakes invalidate the experiment, since there were still plenty of other opportunities to identify changes, including during chord sustains, and nobody picked up on them. Absolutely no one came even close to identifying all the cuts, or really even any of them, and most people, by an order of magnitude, didn't even bother guessing and conceded that they couldn't tell. Of the people who did guess, almost no one bothered with the full mix, and of the guesses on the solo guitars, one person got one cut point correct, while missing the other 9, including 2 between the times they actually identified. So overall, I feel pretty confident saying that these tones were indistinguishable. Now, a few points of interest and discussion. First, as I mentioned, I ended up matching the amps at 2 different drive settings. What made me raise an eyebrow is that to get the part sounding right to me, I lowered the bedonk gain from 6.8 to 6.2. But to match that, I had to take the Archetype amp down from 7.2 to 3.4. I was surprised by this at first, but now that I think about it, it actually makes sense. The whole point of these Archetype plugins, as I understand it, is to be laser focused on a certain kind of tone. So it's understandable that the amps wouldn't have a huge range on the controls. Assuming that you like the sound of that amp to begin with, it gives you a huge sweet spot, and what you give up in flexibility, you gain back in not really being able to make it sound bad. Helix, meanwhile, absolutely gives you enough rope to hang yourself with several times over. But this segues nicely into my next point, which is the people who ask me to match the other amps and effects, to whom I ask, why do you hate me? I have a job and a toddler. I don't have time for... I can't... Fine! But I'm being lazy about it this time. Okay, got where the cuts are? Here's the answer. Incidentally, I matched the Rush channel also with the bedonk, so there's flexibility again. Next is the clean and some of the effects, but I'll tell you right now, this one's close, but it's not 100% matched like the others, so I didn't bother with the substitution comparison. I'll just play you both clips and tell you which was which after. First was Helix, second was Neural. Gojira's reverb has an upper resonance that's just much more prominent than the closest Helix verb, and the amp has this low-end saturation thing I'm not completely confident I nailed. I didn't bother with the pitch effects because they're a whammy and an octave. There's nothing to match. If you want them, toss in the pitch wham or the poly wham with the auto EQ set to 0. The chorus is in there, but I didn't demo the phaser because there wasn't a way for me to sync up the oscillators and keep the sweeps together. However, it sounds very much like the Helix Pebble phaser to me, so it's in the preset. Some people also wanted to hear the last video's examples with the Neural IRs, so I generated versions of that and these examples using the default matched caps. Those are in the YouTube description along with the presets. Finally, there were a couple things that kept coming up in the comments that had me scratching my head a bit. The first was people saying something along the lines of how IRs are the biggest contributors to tone, or that using the same IR for both plugins invalidated the comparison. There's actually a bit to unpack here, so let me try to parse this out and then maybe push back on some of it. IR choice obviously has significant impact on tone, but in the same way that applying post-EQ does. It's a static filter. There's no nonlinearity or dynamic response. In fact, you can really think of them as glorified EQs, or maybe if you think of an EQ as being two-dimensional with frequency and gain, then an IR is in 3 because there's a time component. But what IRs definitely won't do is make one amp sound like, and especially behave like, another. Good amp models, like physical amps, are complex machines full of nonlinearities and parameters interacting with each other. They're dynamic and they have variable behaviors. Frequently, even just changing the level of a single EQ knob in the tone stack will change the way the entire amp responds. This is why my comparison focused on the amps. They're generally the most complicated, volatile, and sensitive things in the chain. In contrast, IRs are a black box that impart their characteristics onto anything fed into them, but they don't change the essence of their input, nor are they affected by it. They're like the filters you can add to photos and Instagram. Impactful, yes, but would you say they make camera and lens selection irrelevant? Running both plugins into the same IR was a requirement for a level playing field to compare the amps, just like you'd want the same lens and post-processing to ideally compare two camera bodies. That's the part I was actually interested in, and there's no way I would have been able to get that kind of result if the amps didn't fundamentally sound or behave the same. If running two amps through the same IR were enough to do that, I'd probably be able to get similar results with other Helix models, and I definitely couldn't. Close, maybe, but they wouldn't be indistinguishable, which is why I made that video to begin with. And furthermore, if they don't sound the same, that is, respond the same way to identical input, then they also won't feel the same when you play them. And that brings me to the other thing I kept seeing in the comments. An assertion that while two tones may sound identical in a comparison, they feel different when you actually play them. To that, all I can think to say is, how? If you're not responding to what you're hearing, what other input is there? I could understand if the tones had, say, subtle but noticeable differences, but in this case, they don't. I can understand the difference between being in front of a cab versus monitors versus headphones, but that also wouldn't apply in this case. And I could see there being an effect of not noticing that something in a tone bothers you unless you actively have the guitar in your hands. Our brains absolutely process sound differently when we're playing versus when we're listening. But even then, if the two tones are the same on playback, they should both exhibit the same problems when you play into them. The only other thing I can think of is latency. If two tones are the same when compensated, but one is laggy in real time. This could happen when comparing something reliant on AD converters, like a modeler, to something purely analog, like a mic'd physical amp. Helix hardware has about a 2 millisecond round trip latency, so that's fairly transparent, but I could potentially see someone cluing into it if they're going back and forth with a mic'd amp in the right circumstances. With our plugins here at a sample rate of 48 kilohertz, Helix Native has a latency of 16 samples, or about a third of a millisecond, while Archetype Gojira reports 106 samples, or 2.2 milliseconds. Maybe that makes a difference? I certainly didn't notice it when I was switching between the two, especially given that this is on top of the 7 or so millisecond round trip I get from a 64 sample buffer with my Helix rack as an interface. And after that, I'm out of ideas. So is there something I missed? Is there some other way that two sounds could be indistinguishable but feel different when you play? Please let me know in the comments or hit my socials, because I feel like this keeps coming up and it's something I'm legitimately interested in trying to understand better. All right, well, that's it. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, because now I've gotten a taste for it, and I feed on your quantifiable approval as validation, like some kind of codependent emotional vampire.